Hey, we're gonna just go through a hand here today. I played against a regular, MasterEdge, on PokerStars PA. It was kind of a basic hand, but we had a little discussion on the river, and it kind of sent me into this whole sort of deeper dive. So I have a bunch of these tabs up. This format is basically I'm just trying to get through this video, share some of my thoughts, so I can close out some of these tabs and kind of have some better answers and direction. So here's a hand. I am in the cutoff, and I have nines, and I'm 3-bet, and I called. Master's Edge is in the small blind here. He's a regular who, will put me in tough spots in battle, and I want to have kind of a strong range here. I think this is pretty standard so far, but the hand plays out like this. He c-bets about 30%. Pretty standard flop call here to protect range. Turn is a king. I think this is where the hand starts getting interesting. I think you can have different strategies here. He opts to check. I think a king, you can craft a lot of strategies that are very high frequency barrels on the king. And so I'm kind of wondering what his range is. I think it's maybe a little less airish because I think you would take advantage of the king. And maybe it does have some pocket pairs here, between nines and queens. Maybe he has a hand like 8-7. Something along those lines. We get to the river. The river is the 9, so I hit a set here on the river. Only hand I'm losing to now is pocket kings and 7-6. It seems a little unlikely that he would have pocket kings or 7-6 given that he didn't barrel the turn, but he leads into me here for a little more than half pot on the river. I think I really only have one option, which is to jam, and I do so. So he's in the spot where I'm repping pretty thin here. This hand like 7-6, maybe pocket nines, maybe 9-8. I don't think I have king 9 of clubs in my range. So he's looking at a pretty thin value range, maybe about 5 combos or so, and potentially a lot of bluffs. And so he calls here looking to bluff catch with pocket tens. So that's a hand, and I want to go into basically a bit more about the turn and river here because I thought it was an interesting spot. MasterEdge's logic here for the river was that he's going to bet call because he can recognize that I have a lot of bluffs here, and his line just looks kind of weak. So that's a hand. I want to get into what I had as my first default database. This is a small blind versus cutoff database. This is what we're looking at as an assumed about small blind 3-bet range. And this is a cutoff defend range. So a lot of this middling kind of stuff we actually share. Some of the 7-6 suiteds, things like 6-5s. I just extend down a little bit farther into my pocket pairs, and I have maybe a little bit more in terms of some suited gappers. Hands like 9-7 suited, 8-6 suited, but that's not going to be full frequency. So looking at this first database, this database was created with a cbet size of 2/3 pot, more or less. And you can see, surprisingly here, it's doing that for more than half the time. Part of that is the nature of an 8-high board. There's a lot of overpair protection that can be had here, a lot of value to be had. So the solver can find a lot of bets here, and it does so. And a lot of the hands that are strong are also mixed here. A hand like pocket 8s, 8-7, even some overpairs, obviously like aces and kings. So there's some mix here. Basically, tendency is it could bet a lot, but it also wants to keep some strong hands in to protect the check range. So we come to the turn, which is the king of hearts. Now, in this database, this strategy, I have, again, essentially about a 2/3 pot bet, and it overwhelmingly uses the king as a hand to bet again. And so this is kind of when I was done with this database. I definitely knew that the king is a hand that you could fire a bit more in terms of this database. Once you start more or less polarizing on the flop, the king is a great card to continue with on the turn, given that you should have knocked a lot of like king X out of the float range of hero, or villain in this case. So moving on, we created another database here with a hand that's a little bit more sort of specific to how it was played. So we're looking at about the 30% flop pot size bet. And this board's slightly more accurate, and pot sizes are more accurate too. So right off the bat on the flop, this third size pot size bet, if you were to play a range bet strategy for, that down bet of around a third of the size, the solver, you can force it to do it, but it's still only betting about half the time, which is obviously, the same as a 2/3 bet. So if you wanted to be betting around half the time or so, the solver is going to be happier to do that with a larger bet size and increasing the EV of that bet. So with the down bet here, the range bet, he bets, and pretty standard obviously call here for my pocket nines. We're pretty much calling our entire range here. We're not even folding much here. And so we come to the turn with the king of hearts. Now with the king of hearts, Master basically with his strategy, if he's only playing essentially a 2-bet strategy on the size, which is either all in, over bet, or more polar bet. This is more like geometric, so we can go about 3/4, turn river to get it all in. He is betting about 2/3 of the time with his 72 combos on the turn. So if he's only playing one bet size on the turn, he is going to be barreling about 2/3 of the time here. The king is a great card to do so. Master realized that a 10-10 is pretty much just a check here. It's part of his checking range along with nines. Jacks are still betting for primarily value and protection. Tens become this hand that you sort of start to defending with. So we take a look at a check here. And with my hand, given my bet options of either shove, 3/4 myself, or sort of like a small fist size bet, we're basically checking back to defend a lot of our range here, nines included. Now I want to hop over to a different sim real quick because I found it curious that I thought the king would be a really good hand and card to continue barreling on. I was kind of surprised when Master didn't do it, and just for my own edification, I wanted to look at a certain spot where here's a board popped out where it's 8-5-2, king on the turn, and I made the only bet size, this sort of 1/4% pot, just to demonstrate something to myself that on a king, the solver is going to look to barrel here a ton, basically 100% here. So if we only played a down bet on the turn instead of that sort of geometric bet, the solver would be betting 100% of his range. And looking at the river after betting 100% of its range, what would it be doing to bet again if it had an option of all in, or about a little more than half, or a little less than half? It's playing a mixed strategy here on the river. It's definitely doing some shoves. It's getting it in with some hands like on the king river or 2 river. And it's also checking a lot, checking primarily on clubs, but the 9 of hearts is a card that it checks about 70% of the time. So the 9 of hearts is a really bad card if you're barreling essentially all your entire range here on the turn. The 9 of hearts is not a great hand to continue with on the river to continue betting again. It's one of the worst ones other than a club flush draw coming in. Now, since I was still surprised, and I just showed that the solver loves to, it would bet 100% of the time if it had the option of just betting about a 1/4 pot. We also are looking here at a strategy. Now we're on the king of hearts turn. What if the solver had 3 bet sizes? It has this down bet, the block, it has the geometric, and it has an over bet. Well, if we get to here and we get to this spot, the solver is going to bet 100% of its range. So if we employ essentially like a 2-size strategy on the turn, we can basically bet 100% of our range. And there's going to be more nuance in figuring out how you bucket what. What is more of like a block bet here? What is a down bet? These jacks, 10s, 9s, the 10s, 9s, 8s region, all that stuff that was kind of getting checked. A lot of checks down in here is just continuing to fire again. And for the larger, the 3/4 bet, that's looking like hands like aces, over pairs, hands that want to get a lot of value from, a lot of less hands, have some protection, our top pair, turn top pair, top kickers. Hand like ace-5 here is barreling, pretty strongly with the non-nut flush redraw. And so you can see that we can craft a strategy here with two bet sizes that would fire 100% of the time. And so I found that to be really interesting. Looking at both strategies, we'll look at the smaller down bet again and what happens on a variety of rivers. You'll see the same thing again, that it's mainly clubs. When you do the down bet on the turn, it's clubs, and then nines are the worst rivers, where we check a lot, about 70% of the time on the club river. But if we were to play the polarization get it in strategy on the turn with a larger bet size, and we look at the river again, we find basically something completely different. Here, there are nines. The nine of heart in particular is being bet with some frequency. It's all in more than half the time. If that's our only river option after polarizing, we have this other like 3/4 bet. So it's basically all in with most of our hands here, other than when the clubs get in. So I found that really to be pretty interesting, that the polarization strategy on the turn completing into the river, it matters a lot. It matters what you're saying and doing and the story you're telling on the turn here. If you're blocking, you have more cards. You have to then be a little bit more cautious on the river. If you're polarizing and betting bigger, you're basically just trying to get it in on the river still with his turn bet size. And the only thing you're really worried about is the flush draw coming in. So continuing to kind of look at some different hands. Sorry, one second. Let me pull up the exact kind of database that we ran and look at. Going back to the actual hand itself. So this is how it's played out. Master did find the check with 10-10 on the turn. And remember that this is the board, so it's like $36 going into the river. The 9 of heart comes off. Again, we'll take a look at the river reports to see the favored leading hands here. So with the bet check bet line from the out of position small blind, the 3-bet lead, it does find basically almost no overbet all-ins, which makes sense. Hands that are generally going to polarize, we saw, are more likely to just continue betting on the turn, wanting to get it all in. But a lot of hands are going to be playing a bet here around half pot. And a lot of this is again where on the 9 river, we're doing some betting here. And pretty much all these rivers are more or less mixed bets. So we're going to take a look at the 9 exactly. Now, here's where the hand varies a little bit, between how Master played it and the difference is 10s here is just, I guess, a little bit too thin. You can find some bets for value here, and which that makes sense. I am definitely in the line that it looked like I probably have a lot of pairs, right, to defend here. After checking back, I probably don't have as many King X floats. A hand like Jacks and Queens is a little bit less likely. So 10s, could be bet for value. I would assume so. I kind of thought that that's maybe exactly what's happening in the circumstance. The solver would prefer 10s to be near pure check here and continue to do this about half pot size bet with just a lot of sets, 2 pairs, top pairs. And it does it with a few no-made hands, just a few bluffs that are in like the Queen Jack kind of region, very low equity hands. So when he bets here, my response is basically I have shoves. What are my shoves? Kings, it's very unlikely I have many kings here, but I may. My shoves here are mainly my set, right? I only kind of have set of 9s primarily, and it actually just says 8s is a call here, and 5s. Isn't that kind of bananas? The solver does not like reopening action with 8s and 5s to bet check bet. I thought that was kind of crazy to find out. The other hand that it's shoving for value here is obviously my combinations of 7-6 suited. The point of discussion that kind of Master was curious about, and I was curious about myself, is where else are we finding bluffs? And I think solver makes a lot of sense here. It's actually finding a lot of bluffs here with 1-card straight blockers. And especially a set blocker is pretty nice too. So a hand like 9-7 suited is shoving all in to protect the sort of bluff shove range. A hand like king nine suited is obviously two pair for value, but an ace nine is being turned into a bluff here. I thought that was pretty interesting given that the ace is a blocker against ace king and aces. So, I mean, I have to assume that's a bluff, right? And then hands like 8-6 suited and 7-6 suited, these are hands that have a pair and basically a straight blocker. So solver's finding all of its bluffs in here through hands that block sets and hands that block straights, pair and straight. So it's basically turning all these hands into bluffs, which is super interesting. The EV is pretty thin in between all of them. It looks like a hand for eights, like 8-6 suited. The EV is only just like a point or two, a couple points higher than what it would be to call, but it is a preferred line. That's where it pulls a lot of its bluffs from. So I found the entire thing really, really interesting, and it caused me to basically write a new database that I was interested in. You know, between the two of them, the first database I was more polarized, and then just a second one that had more betting size options. Looking at this hand again, the board is just slightly different. It was 8 and 2 that were suited, the 5 was unsuited. But here's this database of more of a geometric strategy. So I thought I learned a lot here, and looking at this database, you know, I thought this may be kind of the way that I would play the hand with a new solved strategy. So if I was in the small blind in this case, I would like to find reasons to bet. And I can bet, like I saw from the polarized strategy, about comfortably a higher amount. So if I'm betting a little more than half pot, I can bet 70% of the time, which is wonderful. You know, I'm still protecting basically some of those bets with just some checks of some, pretty strong hands like eights here. But for the most part, I can find a lot of bets, which is great when the small blind gets to the king of hearts turn. And I give it 2 bet sizes, right? We're going to go geometric. The geometric strategy is essentially half, half, half for all in. And then it also has this little block size bet for 20%. Again, on this turn strategy, we're finding a very high frequency bet, close to 100%, basically 90%. I think that's basically the way you want to craft a lot of strategies if you can, is find high frequency reasons to bet through multiple bet sizes. I think that's pretty important. So here in this strategy, we find reasons to bet. Down bets with hands like kings, tens becomes a down bet here on the strategy, nines as well. Jacks are mixed, but yeah, there's just a lot of reasons to continue betting here with this strategy. The king is a really good card for that. And as played, if we were to go with either size, like we saw before, the river here, when we go with our new strategy and we arrive at most rivers, we're going to find out that there's a lot of just high frequency bets and all-ins. And with the down block size on the turn, what are we going to do? We're primarily going to be checking on the river about 70% of the time. We find a few all-ins. We find a few smaller block sizes, but we get to the river basically in 2 different lines here for 2 different sizes, and we have different availabilities to us. As the hand played itself out, if it were to have gone check, check, the preflop raiser in this circumstance would almost never kind of reopen on the river. If it did, it would be with some hands that missed a little bit of value, potentially a check raise opportunity like ace king, king king, hands that were looking to either protect part of the range or check raise, hands that are just slim combinations but are valuable to have in a check line on the turn from the small blind. So the entire hand I thought was really, really interesting in the sense that it helped kind of hone different strategies about the small blind and their ability to do certain things on the turn and flop, what different sizes meant, and how frequencies were all affected. In particular, I found the river bluffing combinations pretty interesting, a little bit intuitive. It wasn't some of them. I thought maybe they're maybe more like potentially missed flush missed flush bluffs, but primarily the best bluffs were set and straight blockers that solver is using in this circumstance. So this is kind of like hopefully an informative video figuring out small blind versus cutoff play, how to craft a little bit of a strategy. And I wanted to get that done because I just had all these tabs up and I spent more time kind of like figuring out the hand than I really thought I would. And I learned a bunch, and I hope it was helpful. And I appreciate you watching, and have a good day.